So if you've ever sat in a history class and just felt like your textbook was, I don't know, predictable, sanitized,
Yeah.
and honestly deeply boring, you were probably right.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a stack of sources that argue these history books are, well, flawed by design. They systematically just cut out the conflict, they erase any real suspense.
And they turn these complex, sometimes terrifying historical realities into simple morality plays, black and white.
Right.
And that's really the core tension we're getting into today. Our mission here is to take you inside the source material, to identify the specific ways history gets distorted, the methods of censorship. We want you to have those aha moments about why the standard story feels so thin.
So it's less about teaching history as this furious debate, informed by evidence, and more about just a list of names and dates.
Exactly. One historian called it just one damn thing after another. And the sources suggest the real goal is to push this message of be a good citizen, but in a way that means don't question the system.
Okay, so how do they do it? What's the mechanism?
The central idea in our source material is a process it calls heroification.
Heroification? That sounds almost medical.
It is, in a way. It's described as a degenerative process, like calcification. It turns these complex flesh and blood people into pious, perfect creatures.
With no flaws.
No conflicts, no pain, no credibility, really. You take a messy, struggling human and just scrub them clean until you're left with a boring statue. A figure that's impossible to look up to because they're impossible to believe in.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start with a big one from the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson. Most people remember him for the League of Nations, maybe for women's suffrage. He's the progressive reformer.
And that's heroification working perfectly because while women did get the right to vote under his administration, the textbooks just kind of bury the fact that Wilson was deeply unsympathetic to the cause at first.
He wasn't just unsympathetic, he had suffragists arrested, right?
He did, for protesting outside the White House. So the credit really belongs to the intense public pressure, the hunger strikes, the protests. They basically forced the issue.
But the textbook narrative shifts that. It becomes about a great man bestowing a right, not a movement that won it.
Precisely. But the really dramatic part is what gets left out completely. I mean, two of his biggest anti-democratic policies just vanish.
Which are?
His decision to racially segregate the federal government, which rolled back decades of progress, and his massive military interventions. Critics at the time called it the bad neighbor policy.
And the scale of that intervention was
huge. Oh, it was huge. The U.S. military intervened in Latin America more under Wilson than almost anyone. We're talking troops in Mexico in 1914, 1916, and then 9 more times. And then Haiti in 1915, the Dominican Republic in 16, Cuba in 17, Panama in 18. It goes on and on.
And how do the textbooks explain this? According to our sources, it's a masterpiece of, rhetorical gymnastics.
It is. Instead of saying Wilson ordered an invasion, they'll use the passive voice. Something like, necessity was the mother of armed Caribbean intervention.
So it just happened. Nobody's fault.
Right. Forces he couldn't control. The hero is protected from the action. And you see that same kind of sanitizing with a figure like Helen Keller.
Okay, so Helen Keller. Everyone knows her story as the woman who overcame these incredible obstacles. She's the ultimate, if she can do it, you can do it model.
Which is true, but that one story is used to completely erase the last 64 years of her life.
64 years, what do they leave out?
They leave out that she was a lifelong, deeply committed, radical socialist.
That's astonishing. Why is that part of her story so important to erase?
Well, she herself once said, conclusions are not always pleasant. The authors want to keep her harmless, non-controversial, so they strip away her politics, her fight for the poor and disabled, and replace it with this vague, politically neutral story about personal triumph.
It makes her uncomplicated, a safe hero.
Exactly. And it seems that hero-making process goes all the way back to our origin stories. I'm thinking about Christopher Columbus.
Right. The brave visionary who knew the world was round when everyone else was afraid of falling off the edge.
A story that is, largely a myth. His real importance isn't that he was first, but how Europe responded to his voyage. And part of that myth-making involves what the source calls Eurocentrism.
So basically downplaying any evidence of earlier contact to keep the focus on European achievement.
That's it. So they minimize the Vikings, right? Textbooks say they merely touched the shore. But the evidence shows a settlement party in 1005, led by Thorfinn and Gudrid Karlsefni. They brought livestock. They stayed for 2 years.
That's a colony, not just a brief visit.
It was a serious attempt. And then there's even more controversial evidence about possible Afro-Phoenicians.
This is where the source gets really interesting.
It does. It cites these colossal basalt heads of West Africans found on the Mexican coast. They're dated to around 750 BC. I mean, the size of these things suggests a real permanent cultural impact.
But the textbooks leave it out.
They do. They say the case isn't conclusively proven, but the effect is it preserves this idea that white Europeans taught the world everything.
And of course, the biggest cover-up is what Columbus actually did when he arrived. The goal wasn't just exploration.
No, it was conquest and exploitation from the very beginning. His own journal, which the source quotes, is just chilling. He sees the Arawak people, notes they're handsome and intelligent, and his immediate conclusion is,
I could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as I pleased.
That's the quote. The shift is immediate. And he didn't just stumble into slavery. He started the transatlantic slave trade right away, kidnapped 10 to 25 people on the first trip, 500 on the second.
And then there was the tribute system he set up in Haiti.
The infamous tribute system. Every person over 14 had to bring in a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months.
And if you didn't,
they cut off your hands.
The numbers in the source are just. I mean, the population of Haiti drops from an estimated 8 million people to fewer than 200 by 1542.
It's genocide by any definition. And it's almost completely absent from the story we're told. And this brings us back to complexity, because the source points out that he had to perform this kind of cognitive dissonance. He had to change his image of the Arawaks from handsome to cruel and stupid to justify his own horrific actions.
Let's shift to another big origin myth, Thanksgiving. It feels like that story is just pre-packaged from the start.
It is. And to really understand the Pilgrim story, you have to first confront the role of disease. It's a massive factor, but it's often minimized. Pre-Columbian people were remarkably healthy. They didn't have livestock transmitting diseases.
But when Europeans arrived, the impact was catastrophic.
Especially in New England. Between 1617 and 1620, so just before the Pilgrims arrived, a plague wipes out between 90 and 96% of the coastal population.
96%.
Governor John Winthrop literally called it miraculous. He said God had cleared our title to this place.
So that event basically explains why the British colonization was successful for the next 50 years.
It ensured there was no real Indian challenge. The famous Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, he didn't ally with the Pilgrims because he felt charitable. He did it because his tribe was so weakened by plague, he needed protection from his rivals.
And the textbooks, they mention the disease, but they bury it.
Right. The source calls it dominance through mentioning. They say it, but it doesn't stick. The focus stays on the nice dinner.
And what about the Mayflower Compact, the foundational document of American democracy?
Yeah, the source argues it was mostly an instrument of minority rule, a document to stop a mutiny.
A mutiny?
The non-Pilgrims on board were furious. They were supposed to go to Virginia, and instead they ended up on Cape Cod. They were ready to rebel. So the compact was basically the Pilgrim leaders doing some quick legal CYA to keep control.
So a sacred moment becomes a practical political maneuver.
Exactly. And that leads us to the bigger structural issues that authors just avoid. The great taboos. Our source points to 3: sex, religion, and social class.
Social class seems huge. How big of an omission is that?
It's massive. 6 of the 12 textbooks surveyed had no index entry for social class, inequality, or anything like it.
Oh.
And if you leave that out, you're presenting America as this pure meritocracy where success is all about hard work. It completely ignores how social structure, things like unequal schooling, works to replicate inequality generation after generation.
And it encourages blaming the victim. If you fail, it's because you weren't ambitious enough, not because the system is stacked against you.
Precisely. Now, on race, textbooks have gotten better. They mostly admit slavery was the cause of the Civil War now, but they still whitewash white complicity, starting right with the Founding Fathers.
Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death.
Yeah, 8 months after that famous speech, he ordered patrols to stop his own slaves from accepting the British offer of freedom. The contradiction is just staggering, and it's left out.
And then there's Abraham Lincoln. Even he gets protected. Textbooks love to quote that 1862 letter where he says he would save the Union whether you freed the slaves or not.
They do, but they almost always cut off the very next sentence where he says, "And I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free."
So they strip out the context.
They strip out his personal morality. It
Yeah.
makes him look like a cold political operator, not a man wrestling with an impossible situation. They even censor his opponents, like Stephen Douglas. They take out his overtly racist statements.
Why? Why protect the villain?
Because if you hide how pervasive and mainstream racism was, even among powerful leaders, you handicap students. You make it impossible for them to see racism as this persistent structural force in American life.
Which all leads back to this idea of the heroic state. Our source calls these books anti-citizenship manuals because they just encourage you to accept what the government does.
Absolutely. Take foreign policy. The financial motives are almost always ignored. Interventions are presented as humanitarian acts. A textbook might say the U.S. urged Wall Street to pump dollars into Haiti, hoping to head off trouble.
It sounds so civic-minded.
But then you have this quote from Marine General Smedley Butler, who said he helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests and made Haiti a good place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenue. That kind of firsthand evidence just gets erased.
The same thing happens with Vietnam, right? The searing images are just gone.
All gone. The monk on fire, the photo of Kim Phuc, the My Lai massacre, they're all in the memory hole. If you sanitize the moral cost, you ensure students won't question the fundamental goodness of the American side.
And this is so crucial in the civil rights movement because the textbooks end up crediting the federal government, Kennedy Johnson, for making change happen.
When in reality, federal agencies like the FBI were often antagonists. J. Edgar Hoover was a white supremacist who ran a vicious campaign to destroy Martin Luther King Jr.
Wiretaps trying to smear him.
And even sending him an anonymous note suggesting he commit suicide.
Unbelievable.
So instead of showing how citizens, black and white, force the government to act, the textbooks present it as a top-down gift. It reinforces that idea of the passive citizen waiting for the heroic state to save them.
So at the end of the day, what you're left with is this ideology of progress, right? With a capital P.
Yes, an incurable optimism. The idea that progress is linear, automatic, always upward. A kind of chronological ethnocentrism.
And that kind of blind faith makes it impossible to grasp real structural problems.
Right. Our source notes how textbooks just couldn't handle the 1973 oil embargo. They offered these mindless assurances that the crisis had eased off because people were buying smaller cars. They just paper over the deep systemic issues.
It also makes it impossible to teach something like the tragedy of the commons.
A foundational concept. The idea that what's good for the individual in the short term, like every family grazing 2 cows on the shared pasture, can destroy the system for everyone in the long term.
Concepts you kind of need to understand environmental issues.
Or any public good. But it's totally incompatible with the progress is always good narrative.
So, what's the final takeaway here? What's the cost of all this sanitized history?
The cost is huge. You give students these boring, irrelevant, unrealistic role models. They end up cynical, boring, as they'd say, but they don't have the tools to understand why society is the way it is or how to change it. History class is supposed to teach critical thinking, but these books instill blind allegiance.
Our sources suggest that by denying the humanness of figures like Keller or Wilson, you're basically keeping students in a state of intellectual immaturity. And since most people don't trust the government as blindly as they did in the 50s, this refusal to talk about government wrongdoing just makes all education seem suspect.
Right.
It prepares them for passivity, not for solving problems.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. If the history we are taught is designed primarily to protect our national ego, what painful but necessary truths about our present, about inequality, about environmental crises, about the abuse of power are we failing to confront? Because we never learned how to confront the uncomfortable, flawed realities of our past.